Well, our international affairs commentator Doug Herbert joins us. Doug, first I want to start off with Vladimir Putin. He's calling this a special military operation. It's all going to plan, but the reality is quite different, isn't it?
The reality is it's not going to plan anything but. The reality is that Vladimir Putin's military campaign has been stymied in its early hopes of a swift victory, a sort of cakewalk across Ukraine and a quick conquest that he could sell to the Russian people and have a quiescent Ukraine under Russia's thumb. The reality is is following a very disturbing pattern, very similar, almost a cookie-cutter blueprint of what we saw in the devastating military campaigns Russia waged in Grozny on Russian soil in the Russian Federation, in Chechnya, during over 2 wars, and also in Syria, in Aleppo, famously. It's a scenario whereby, after being stymied on the ground, you have just devastation by aerial blitzkrieg, essentially, bombings and civilian targeting of civilians while denying it. That is this very brutal aerial tactic of targeting of civilians, hospitals, schools, maternity wards, bread lines, so on and so forth, alongside a virulent disinformation campaign that keeps the vast majority of Russians in the dark about what's really happening. And when they are told about anything that's happening, let's even take the case of Mariupol, that where we've seen some of the worst devastation in this war. It's always a case Russia's never the aggressor. Russia never is doing any wrong. It's always the Ukrainians firing on themselves, Ukrainians trying to target their own civilians in order to then turn the tables and blame the Russians. It's clearly ludicrous when we have eyewitnesses on the ground. We have the video evidence. We have sometimes soldiers themselves who are captured talking about the brutality of what they themselves have been doing. In the case of Mariupol, which you can see there in the southeast, it is definitely the worst case. I mean, we have sort of like a siege of Leningrad sort of thing during the war, the famous siege of Leningrad. You've had to date 3 schools bombed, devastated. You have had a hospital, a maternity ward. You have thousands of civilians literally crouching in shelters, unable to escape, the vast majority of them, through these so-called humanitarian corridors. Yes, a few thousand, by some estimates, have managed to get out before they were officially set up. But the cynical tactic of Russia has been you set up these humanitarian corridors, the shelling begins almost immediately. Civilians trying to escape are shelled, at the risk of their lives, along these corridors, and then Russia accuses the Ukrainians of preventing the civilians from being able to get out. So it's literally the most cynical wartime tactic you could have. Corridors to let civilians escape, then turning the tables and accusing the adversary of preventing their own civilians from getting out.
You were mentioning that most Russians are in the dark about what's happening because of Russian propaganda. How has Putin's narrative changed in the last month?
Not an iota, absolutely not a letter, not a word. If anything, it has gotten more determined, more bitter, more angry, more rageful, more grievance-filled, and more paranoid. Let me just bring up a few of his quotes here, where this was in his speech yesterday, which we widely reported on. We're always saying we can't read Putin's mind. We don't have to read Putin's mind because, look, he himself gives us telegraphs, gives us a window into exactly what he's thinking, what he's saying. So I'm going to actually start with the very last quote there. The collective West wants to use its 5th column to strive to achieve its aims. What is the 5th column? The 5th column are Russians living geographically in Russia, but Putin says they may be living in Russia, making rubles for their income, but their mentality, their spirit, their minds are in the West, the foie gras eating, the French Riviera visiting West. So it's this decadent sort of internal rot, the enemy of the people. There was a Soviet-era term, vrag naroda, enemy of the people. We're hearing that language vividly evoked in this 5th column talk. We'll never allow Ukraine to become a stronghold of aggressive actions against our country, going right back to what our reporters on the ground are saying right there, that Ukraine is the aggressor. Right. Ukraine, potentially nuclear armed, the neo-fascist Nazis are out to get and threaten Russia's very existence. A ludicrous, ridiculous turning on its head of what is the real narrative, which Russia is absolutely threatening to obliterate Ukraine into oblivion. They're trying to dismember Russia, they being the West. This is the perennial millennial narrative of Russia, where the West has nothing better to do with its time but to think of ways to make Russia weak and dependent and humiliate Russia. And finally, if the West, this is for me the most telling one, if the West thinks that Russia will step back, it does not understand Russia. You've asked our reporters on the ground what people think of the peace deal. We heard Gulliver saying before that people in Western Ukraine don't talk about it. They have very low expectations when they do. That's the reason why. They don't trust Russia. They know how Putin thinks, and they know that Putin is not going to give an inch, regardless of what is said officially about brighter hopes ahead for perhaps a compromise in peace talks.
Do you share that pessimism about the peace talks?
It's hard not to, because Putin himself has made it clear that he is absolutely determined to go full throttle. The peace talks, as they've been sort of reported, sources close to the talks, parts of the so-called peace plan have gotten out, tentative plan whereby Ukraine would sort of give up its neutrality, that is, its ambitions to join NATO. It would be able to keep its army, but in return for security guarantees, Russian would be an official language of Ukraine. Russia would have a ceasefire and withdraw its troops. We have zero, and I have to emphasize zero, indication that Vladimir Putin, especially based on his most recent statements, is anywhere near agreeing to that. And even if he signs the piece of paper agreeing to those terms, his interpretation of what respecting those terms mean would be 180 degrees different from what the Ukrainians' expectations of respecting that agreement.
So even if there is an agreement, who knows if they would upheld their end of the bargain?
The agreement is whatever Russia says the agreement is. And if Russia says if something goes wrong with the agreement in Ukraine's view, it will always, by definition, by Putin's definition, be the Ukrainians' fault. By Putin's definition, the Russians are always acting in good faith. The Russians are doing no wrong. Everything that can go wrong can only be the fault, by definition, of the Ukrainians.
Okay. Our international affairs commentator, Doug Herbert. Doug, thanks as always for your analysis.